Nick Gillespie, welcome to Dad Saves America.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be saved. You know,
You need to be
I
saved,
need to
Nick.
be saved. Yes, yes, I
We
do.
should call this the Special Italians in Black edition. Um,
It's a
uh,
very forgiving color.
so we'll talk about a lot of stuff.
Yeah,
I want to start with, I think, an area that can draw a bunch of contrasts in philosophy.
hmm
We are in this moment, and one of the weirdest things of our moment
mm,
is RFK being part
right,
of a right wing coalition
yeah,
politically, and um, all the opinions about that. So
right,
I haven't had a chance to
yeah,
interview RFK, but you have.
yeah.
So, what's your take on RFK, on the prospect of him um, playing a large role in
Yeah.
health and food regulation in the U.S.?
Well, first off, I want to point out too, just to linger on that moment of him being part of a, right-wing conservative Republican administration. He's also Mr. Health. He pumps himself, by his own admission, he pumps himself full of testosterone, and he's on a longevity plan. So he's taking in all kinds of chemicals and things like that. But he works for, he's all about clean food supply and getting rid of additives and all of this. And he works for the least healthy president since like William Howard Taft, who forced him famously in that photo to eat McDonald's and drink a Coke.
Starting off
Yeah.
on you're a big fan, I can tell.
Well, no. What I'm saying is, like,
Yeah.
we need to recognize the kind of bizarre absurdity of the moment. And I'm not saying this is good or bad. It's like it was insane that Joe Biden was shuffling along. Like, who is that old character on the Carol Burnett show, played by Tim Conway, the old man who could barely move? Like, that was our president. That is our president.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and that ended, and then something new, bizarre came. We're living in a moment of historical unfolding absurdities all the time. So
That's certainly true.
that I will say for RFK Jr., who I interviewed along with my colleague Zach Weissmuller at Reason for like 90 minutes, is very wide ranging. I think the guy is kind of cuckoo. He believes virtually every conspiracy theory about anything. It doesn't matter. He's into chemtrails. He believes that atrazine is turning frogs gay, and that has implications for humans. You name it. Sirhan did not kill his father. I mean, he is all over there. He is touching a chord in people, or striking a note in people, because he is trying to make sense of like the type of world where he is suddenly in the Trump cabinet as Health and Human Services Secretary. So he, in a way, he is personifying, or we're modeling on him. Like, how do you make sense of this world that we live in? And he's seeking, for certain kinds of truths. It's always a dark, shadowy truth where nothing we do quite matters, because there's these vast array of people. It's big pharma, it's big food, big ag, whatever. The CIA, who he thinks killed John F. Kennedy, as well as had something to do with his father, right? I'm just saying, like, he, in a world that seems very fragmented and difficult to understand, that I always talk about it, we're living in a Philip K. Dick universe, just where everything is weird, nothing is what it seems to be. He is trying to make sense of that. And that, I think, is part of his appeal and his mania for control on certain things.
All right, here's your obligatory reminder to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell. It really actually does help us out a lot. When we're trying to book awesome new guests, they look at how many subscribers are on the channel and they say, yep, this is worth doing. And I want to bring the best possible people to you that I can. Speaking of which, let's get back to the conversation.
I have gone through my own ever evolving personal challenge / relationship with some of what you just said.
Yeah.
Because I came into this world of ideas very much through like Ron Paul
Mm-hmm.
and
Also a conspiracist. And I don't mean that I don't even,
yeah, I guess
don't
you're
mean
right
that
in a certain sense.
pejoratively. I mean it descriptively, that nothing in Ron Paul's world and in RFK Jr.'s world, nothing just happens. There's always a motivation behind it. There is somebody's making things happen, some system, etc.
Well, this is okay. So this is one interesting place to push
Yeah.
and explore together. So Ron Paul introduced me to this Austrian school of economics.
Right.
So that's Hayek and Mises.
Mhm.
And when you like jump into the deep water with those types of thinkers, you arrive at something. I mean, gosh, the organization behind this that I founded, emergent order,
Mhm.
spontaneous order.
Right.
It is like an antithetical to like powerful conspiratorial forces.
Right.
It's the notion that there aren't designers of the universe,
Mhm.
except perhaps metaphysically.
Things are a result of human action, not of human design. Right.
Yeah.
That's what markets are. That's what the extended order is.
Yeah, that's language. There is no creator of
Right.
the words
Yeah.
we use. They happen. They happen in this super decentralized way, which I think is true, observably true. But it is also true, and I think
Mhm.
the ethos of emergent order and of a libertarian mindset sometimes gets unwilling to look actual conspiracies in the face.
Yeah.
You know, like the Fed was an
Right.
actual conspiracy.
Right.
They actually, people went under false pretenses to Jekyll
Yeah.
Island. You could say, oh, well, there was a reason for that. They didn't want to crash the dollar or something, but it was literally a conspiracy. We have gone through a bunch of these recently. The COVID attempts to silence any
Right.
talk of the lab leak, the Hunter Biden laptop.
Mhm.
We have been bombarded
Yeah.
and then had it revealed that there are actually dark, shadowy forces.
Right.
effing
No,
with us.
and also, and I think this is really important, that human activity changes things. Like, that certain people come up with ideas and put them into the political mainstream, the economic or not even mainstream, slipstream, et cetera. And then that changes, and this is where there's always a tension between conspiracy thinking and again, let's call it conspiracists, where it's just like, okay, stuff doesn't happen. It is always directly or one step away from a direct action of a shadowy cabal of people. That kind of mindset is wrong in its extreme forms. And also, often it jumps into other types of things which don't make a lot of sense. But the idea that individuals matter, and that your actions every day matter. Like you are, if not the sum of your choices matter, and other people's choices matter. Because before we delve into something more specific, perhaps,
Yeah.
Where I came into libertarianism, it was really through reading Reason magazine when I was in high school and college. And I had been seasoned for it through a healthy dose of like teenage existentialism. I read people like Camus and Sartre. And go back to somebody like Philip K. Dick, the science fiction novelist who's do androids dream of electric sheep, became Blade Runner. He did Total Recall, or the short story Total Recall's based on. Man
These
in the
are all
High
things
Castle.
that kind of cut at the question of where does your agency as an individual
Right. Well,
even,
and I was
going to
say where conspiracist thinking leaves me a little bit cold is that I believe that mostly the universe is indifferent to us. And it can either be a benign or a malign indifference, but that when something bad happens to me, it is rarely directly the result of, a cabal of very specific people, going after me. And it's more like, this is the way the world works. And, I've been struggling thinking about, there's Camus famously wrote The Myth of Sisyphus essay, and I've been thinking more and more about how do we get to a Promethean age where we are stealing fire from the gods, but the gods don't really care. It's like, but this is what we need to figure out, a real sense of agency and autonomy that helps us make our world, however small or however big we envision that, better.
I think the thing that is hard for people, I think the concept of emergent order, or that, I think the concept of emergent order is fundamentally very difficult to grasp, because it asks you to hold two realities in coexistence.
Right.
That I can be acting in my life and that my choices matter.
Yeah.
But that there's this extended world in which my influence on that extended world, it might be close to zero. I mean, a very tangible example is efficient market hypothesis, right? So the idea that, you should probably just buy an index fund and ride the S&P 500 because no individual betting on the stock market knows anything.
Yeah.
So it's this like, wait, do my choices matter in the universe,
Right.
or do they not matter at all? So
Right.
when I'm hearing they don't matter at all, it doesn't leave me with a lot of ways to think about
Yeah.
things like, and I think libertarianism writ large, the movement, the thinkers, I haven't encountered a lot of people who think about the role of leadership in the social order.
Right.
Like, how might a Steve Jobs change, make a dent in the universe? Like he said to the Pepsi Cola CEO,
John Scully.
John Scully. And I think maybe that's like libertarians are kind of reactionary against the great man theory of history. And so instead of being like, well, actually, leaders actually do matter.
Sure. Yeah. No, and I think about this a lot because, and a lot of this is, it's all a matter of degree. But like, did it matter that Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980? Probably in the grand scheme of things, maybe not so much. And like, did communism end because Reagan was elected in 1980? Would it have ended anyway? Would it have ended 10 years later? Maybe it would have ended 10 years sooner, or well, it wouldn't have 10 years sooner. But so like you're constantly playing a lot of variables of like, okay, well, your actions matter, but you're not going to determine the entire world. Leadership definitely matters. And I think it's worth thinking about, and I realize it's very abstract, but
it's okay.
Thinking maybe leadership is one way of talking about it, because it matters that Ron Paul came along, and it matters that in 2008, like he caught fire. He had been saying virtually the same thing his entire public career, going back to the 70s.
Yeah.
But it caught fire in 2008 and 2012. And why is that? And it's partly Ron Paul. And if it wasn't Ron Paul, then that doesn't happen because he was espousing a particular set of ideas. But then what changed that people were suddenly receptive to it in a way that they weren't in 1988 when he ran for the Libertarian Party, as the Libertarian Party presidential candidate and got like 400,000 votes.
Yeah. I mean, in a very real sense, if not for him in 2006 and 7, you and I wouldn't, I would probably be still working. I would have probably been laid off in one of the many rounds of consolidation at Viacom turned Paramount turned. Are we out of business?
Right. Yeah.
So you can look at these threads that weave the tapestry of your life just individually and say, wow, that really mattered a lot. That teacher really mattered. That moment really mattered.
Yeah.
So I want to bring this back to RFK.
Okay.
So here you have this figure who has been in our public discourse for a long time. At one point talked about like jailing like the Koch brothers.
That's right. Climate deniers, climate criminals, he called them. Yeah.
But then was it last summer he actually spoke at the Freedom Fest, which is a wonky gold bug libertarian conference you and I go to every summer.
Now they're on to Bitcoin because gold is kind of like the luster is a little bit off gold, right? We have digital gold now.
Well, the state can just come and steal your gold.
I understand that, yeah. Whereas if we know our keys, we can walk across every border in the world without declaring anything.
Yeah, you can memorize the numbers and then they can't steal your mind.
That's right.
So there's a weirdness here in which I find myself and several of my friends also find themselves being pro-individual liberty, pro-small government, and also liking RFK.
Yeah.
I don't fully know why, and I don't know if it's just mood affiliation.
Yeah, that might be a you problem, John. No, well, but you know what I will say about it is like, so I said, like, I think, when you look at the totality of what he talks about, and for instance, he wrote a book about how his cousin, Michael Skakel, did not really kill this young girl, Martha Moxley, in Greenwich, Connecticut. And he identifies two racial and ethnic minorities as the real villains, right? And it's like, no, he's nuts, right? On a profound level. It doesn't mean that his moment in time and place here isn't meaningful. And like what I find interesting about him First was, why did he catch fire as an independent candidate? You know, and he was polling at 15, 20% at various points. And I think it's very important to recognize he's a baby boomer. He's 10 years younger than Trump and Biden, but he's part of that. And he has a very famous name, which he never lets you forget, because in virtually every conversation within 30 seconds, he will mention his uncle and his father, and that wears heavily on him. But it also legitimates him. If he was Joe Bag of Donuts, we wouldn't be listening to him in the same way. And he is an artifact of a dying planet, of like a boomer post-war construction of meaning that Biden and Trump and Kamala Harris in her way and they were all part of. So that, you got to look at it in that kind of larger context. What I find interesting about him is, if he becomes Health and Human Services Secretary, he will have the potential to change the way we've thought about things, or the way that certain things are regulated at the FDA, for instance. And that's pretty good. Like, I'm not saying I want to hang out with him, but it's like he might be the person, along with Trump, who appoints him to legalize a wide variety of psychedelic substances, or decriminalize them, or return control of them over to local states and jurisdictions. And it's like, wow, that is kind of amazing. Like, the idea, and I've talked about this in a variety of contexts, the idea that Donald Trump, who is the least psychedelic president ever,
No, he's
probably,
a total straight edge.
Yeah. And it's like he might be the person who radically changes the drug war in America, or ends it as it is. It's in its final stages, but it could last another 50 years. It could last another 5 years.
I think that I was talking to somebody last night about this, that there's, and maybe this is like justification, because I voted for Trump. I talked about it a little bit on the show. Not as advocacy, but just as a fact to discuss. And I don't
Thank you for doing that, because I hate, no, I and as a journalist, and I hang out with a lot of journalists, and they'll always be like, oh, well, I don't say who I voted for or whatever. And it's like, screw you. Like, what is wrong with you? Like, we're all adults here.
Well, it's funny because I think that I grappled with this a little bit, because the show is not a partisan enterprise along the parties. We're trying to talk about big ideas that matter to our country, to our families, and where our agency can act, where we can do things. And so at one level, it's like, well, you're gonna get political.
Yeah.
But then it's like, I'm obviously like a right of center guy. I'm not a commie.
Right.
So to pretend that I don't have a point of view, or that I'm not going to make a choice, just feels like cowardly.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, it's, part of the sickness of our current age is that politics has moved, from, maybe politics should be like your fourth or fifth identifier of like, who am I?
Yeah.
And it's like, it's, one or two for most people. And we're in a blood sport. So like, if you voted for Trump, how could I ever talk to you? How could I ever trust you? Or if you voted for Harris,
right,
then you are, that brings on a whole barrage of and it's like, we need to get past that.
One of the things that went into my model, aside from sort of being a South Philly guy that actually kind of likes how, like, what a brouillon he is, like this bull in the china shop thing. I actually like that. The model I think is perhaps most operative, and I want to get your take on this, is Travis Kalanick.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think that there's something in the like cluster of factors that constitute a human psychology, a temperament, like a gut, that make it that when you have to go against really hard stuff that is going to try to destroy you, there's only certain kinds of people that'll tolerate that.
Right.
Travis Kalanick was one of them. He was the, CEO of Uber. He led it through the hardest phase of its development, which was going up against taxi cab unions, local political bosses, then the entire media who turned on him. And he's demonized as this like bro who's, really rough around the edges and hard driving. They made this pretty bad series about him.
Yeah.
But
It was and it was part of there were a spate of series about like the guy who founded WeWork,
Yeah,
and there was one other at the same time. I'm trying to remember what it was,
Oh,
but
it was the woman with the
with Theranos.
Theranos, yeah.
And it was interesting to see them lumped together, and they were all very anti-capitalist. And Uber, Uber is like a great service that changed the way people live for the better, barely not making money or, kind of making money, et cetera. So it's, kind of a mitzvah that the people who back it, like, carried it for so long so that you and I could get cheap rides places, especially outside. This is part of the disconnect with the Uber criticisms was, if you live in New York or DC or San Francisco, maybe like, oh, well, there are a lot of cabs. If you lived in one of the boroughs in New York, or if you lived in a smaller city where there's like 10 cabs, Uber was a game changer. And my older son went to Ohio State in Columbus. And between the introduction of Uber and like 10 years later or 5 years later, drunk driving convictions had disappeared basically.
Yes.
And it's because
Yes.
Columbus has, 10 cabs, but then it had like 1,000 Uber drivers, and
Well-
it's just better. But people can't see that. And I'm sorry to hijack your conversation, but it's like,
Please.
one of the things that we need to recognize, and this is certainly true of Trump, it's true of RFK Jr., it's true of Kamala Harris. Like, I'm not expecting my political leaders to be moral paragons. I don't want them to be
bad call.
actual criminals, and there's a wide discussion to have about this kind of stuff, or the business leaders. Like, I'm not asking them to take care of my kids or to take my dog to the vet. It's like, have they injected something into our world that makes our life better?
Well, and you touched on something, and the ethos here is very interesting because one of the I remember, used to live here in New York.
Yep.
Now we're in Austin, and there was this is going back a couple of years, but I lived in what Charles Murray called the bluest zip code in Texas, 78704. And I was on one of these local like next door chat room things, and all the crunchy lefties hated Uber. And they hated that Uber came into the town, and they're mouthing off about, because for a time the city council actually banned Uber from the city.
Yeah.
And it was obvious they were just working on behalf of narrow taxi cab crony scumbags.
Right.
And they're talking about big corporate power coming in. And I was like, how? It was kind of fun to take this posture. How dare you put our children's lives at risk? We are in a university town, UT, 100,000 students, all getting drunk on 6th Street on the weekends. And you are killing our kids by banning the service that lets them get home to their dorms safely.
Yeah.
You're forcing them to do things that put them in harm's way out of your stupid ideology about corporations. And it's that kind of, so what kind of person can put up with that level of and slings and arrows and still stay on course and not be totally destabilized and lose their mind?
Right.
It's something like a functional psychopath, I think.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people say that about kind of CEOs, and particularly, real disruptive ones. Steve Jobs, it's fascinating, because he died and because everybody in the Occupy movement had a Mac. Like, you didn't see a lot of HP, when they would flip up their laptop.
Well, we have
to
it now,
tap
right?
about
The
how-
Teslas, all the lefties driving Teslas.
Yeah, Steve Jobs is loved in a way that had he survived and had he persisted, he might not have been, because he was a difficult personality by all accounts. But again, there's like, you get to a point, and I think a lot about this because of my backgrounds in literary and cultural studies. There are certain authors or filmmakers, when you learn about their personal lives, you're like, I want to separate the art from the artist, but like at a certain point, like, I don't.
Woody Allen.
Yeah, well, no, because Woody Allen is, he had a couple of gross episodes in his life, but he's not a criminal. Somebody like Roman Polanski, I think, is an actual, he admitted to statutory and taking advantage of a minor in a disgusting way, and then has been fed it all. Like, I don't need to see any more Roman Polanski movies in my life. I can find there's an infinite number of great movies.
He just missed his time. If he waited another 15 years, he wouldn't even have been
Yeah,
ostracized.
be all of this be as it may, there are limits to how far somebody can go. But to your point, like the people who are going to break stuff and get us to the next level of something, generally are, they're that way throughout most parts of their lives, and it's going to be unseemly. But we shouldn't reject Uber because because Travis Kalanick had was not the greatest boyfriend in the world, right?
Yeah, so with a certain amount of agreement on that, how do you look at the opportunity and the optimism versus pessimism as a paragon of
Yeah.
libertarianism?
So this is an interesting question because one of the things that's fascinating about Trump, and I'm glad that Kamala Harris lost. I voted for Chase Oliver because since 1988, I've always voted for the Libertarian Party candidate because I like third parties.
Yeah,
And I like the LP, comes closest to, expressing who I am. But what's interesting to me about Trump and RFK Jr. is kind of in this camp.
and
Ron Paul
Tulsi.
is in this camp. Well, what I was going to say is that they are, they're opening up space for stuff, but they're very negative people. Like everything is a conspiracy and everything is darkness all the time. Trump, when the Madison Square Garden rally that he had before he was elected, like the people before him really were harsh and negative. And I would implore everybody to watch Stephen Miller's comments about America being for Americans and whatnot. And it really was disturbing and it, messed up, like very negative, very harsh. Trump was actually kind of light, but like when people think of Trump, they're not like, oh, you know what, he's going to usher in an age of candy canes and cotton candy. He's like a dark guy who is going, he's promised to deport families. If there's one illegal, the whole family can leave together and stuff like that. And it's weird to me. And Ron Paul is also like weirdly, he's both on a certain level, he's, talking about like the absolute human freedom, but then it's also like everything is a conspiracy, and that these shadowy forces are moving in and restricting our liberty so that, the dollar isn't worth what it was when the Fed was, and like we're in chains everywhere. And part of me is kind of like, I don't get that because like, I know in my lifetime, and I'm 61 years old, and especially when I take it back to my parents who were born in the 20s and what my kids' life is looking like, I'm like, God, things keep getting better and better.
This is
So,
the hardest part.
yeah.
And it's partly that so one thing is, so I love Rational Optimist, Matt Ridley, there's Steven Pinker, there's this is maybe the thing that's broken for me a little bit in that we have a genuine mental health decline in America. I think that's real. That's like measurable.
Okay.
And that in and of itself is really weird because we are, in pure material terms, the wealthiest society humankind has ever seen, with, to some extent, the most opportunity for anyone born today has more options and choices that they face over their life than any prior generation, with fewer constraints, fewer people shaming them, telling them no, telling them they're not allowed to do that.
Right. Or just categorically dismissing you because you're from Southern Italy, or you're black or you're gay or whatever.
Right. And we can spend an hour of time, and what we can buy with the income we earn in an hour makes 100 years ago look like we live like kings.
Yeah.
And yet it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to the human being. Like, we adapt to the current circumstances and we don't care that the graphs go up and to the right. We just don't care. Like, it's clear that we don't. Like that, like the optimism sale doesn't have purchasing power with most people, and it's some cognitive thing. But to dismiss it as, oh, it's just our irrational quirks, feels like elitist.
Yeah, I'm not saying
I'm not saying you're saying that
no, I'm
necessarily.
not saying to dismiss it, but it's also worth looking at, the concept of revealed preference of, people talk a game of like, oh, well, it's just over. We can't do anything, but they keep investing. But they keep showing up for work and things like that. And, when you look at suicide rates, which is probably a better measure than things like depression, because
Yeah.
these are more broadly socially defined, and it can change. We're doing well, and like and again, this is when we
We're doing well
recognize,
on suicide rates?
compared to earlier decades and things like that. We're
Oh,
not. I mean,
interesting.
and overall, it's also, we're doing better living wise, or longevity, for all the talks of deaths of despair. If anybody, if you were born in a particular year, you have a higher, you are more likely to live longer than the people that were born the year before you, and less likely to live as long as the people who were born a year after you. And this is not to minimize or dismiss people who feel like they don't have meaning in their lives. But that's, this is what I call it, the agony of abundance. And we can see it, I think, in younger generations where, younger millennials and Gen Z, who are doing fabulously well, even by things like, okay, do they own houses, at what age and whatnot? They're doing really well, and they are complaining about it. Like, that is something where leadership is called for, I think, from a libertarian point of view, because I think developments in libertarian thinking and economic policy and social policy is why things have gotten better. But we need to complete the task and explain to people why having more choices doesn't lead to paralysis or to depression and things like that.
How do you diagnose? Let's assume that that's correct. How do you diagnose the disconnect there? Because there's a lot of forces at work culturally, and I think we can. This is fun to have a kind of all over the place conversation, because I also think it's kind of the way a lot of your writing, you synthesize.
Scattered ADD,
yes.
which we have better drugs for than we've ever had in all of human history. Going back, we have more prescription drugs than all the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. So,
but you bring a bunch of lenses to bear on things,
Yeah.
which I think is really fun and useful in times like this, where there's a lot of, it's like, how do I make sense of this world? So one is, you have to grapple with, well, why is it that so many people feel the country is heading in the wrong direction? And clearly, and either if they feel like it's happening in their life, or they're not recognizing where their life is going better than it would have gone, or what's your diagnosis for that?
So it's a bunch of things. And one is that, you can look at Gallup, carries this or follows this. The number of people who think the country is going in the wrong direction, it's like, 75%.
Yeah.
If you ask people, how is your personal situation going? And about 75% say it's getting better. So there's, it's easy to project onto a world and say, like, I don't like the way things are going. But, weirdly, my life is going pretty well. My life is going exceedingly well. I think a lot goes into that's a contradiction that is worth kind of plumbing, because that's where a lot of people are. And then when you think the world is going bad, but your personal situation is going well, you start projecting out solutions onto the world, which end up limiting people's choices. Or calling for a return to all kinds of repression and all kinds of, enforced normalcy, which I find, troubling, because, like, the way I read history, and, and this is a crackpot, bad history, but, like, before World War II, America, and I've only lived in America, and I really only know America, but before World War II, America was generally a poor country, and it had a lot of, like, low income, low education people pouring in, like my grandparents, I suspect yours.
Yep.
And then after World War II, things changed, and, like, we became a wealthy country, and we started to have more and more choices in our lives. And people talk about how the fabric of society started falling apart. And, like, if you go back and look in the 50s, conservatives in the 80s they created a fake history saying, like, the 60s, that's when everything went to hell. But if you actually go back and read books that were written in the 50s, they were all about, like, why Johnny can't read. They were about juvenile delinquency, which didn't even really exist as a concept because teenagers didn't exist as a concept before the 50s because kids worked. They weren't juveniles. They were like little adults, and suddenly you had kids who didn't have to, who got to go to school to finish high school, where like a majority of people finished high school and then started going to college. But like the 50s, which was a decade of unprecedented wealth, broad-based wealth and acquisition, was also the most anxious decade ever in American history because not in spite of those choices, but because of those. To get more to your point, like what explains this? A big part of it is bad history or a lack of interest in history. And we're very presentist. And I think this comes and goes in cycles. But, 50 years ago, in 1974, the best-selling car in America was the Pinto. And now, like, if you think about that and everything that kind of emanates out from that, it was a crappy car that was, prone to exploding if it got picked, if somebody flicked the back bumper in a particular way. Our world is phenomenally better, materially, but also personally and psychologically, in that, like, if you are a woman, you can enter the workforce at par with men. If you're gay, you're good. If racial discrimination, ethnic discrimination is all a fraction of what it was. More people have houses now than in 1974. Vastly more people go to college or have the option of going to college. We need to start thinking about history and about the genealogy of like where we come from, because if you benchmark, where you are based on what, Elon Musk has or Jeff Bezos or something like, maybe you feel bad. If you benchmark where your parents or your grandparents were, 50 years ago or 100 years ago, things are better and getting better. And that will change your appreciation both for what your options are, but also what are the policies and things that tended to get there. And this, I'm sorry if I'm rambling.
No, this
to
is
go
what
to
you're here for.
One of the questions about contradictions of libertarian thinking, and I think about this a lot, is that there's a sense that there's a zero sum, of human freedom, and people.
If you have a pile of berries, there's only so many berries on the tree.
Yeah,
you pick too many, off with your head.
Yeah, and Jefferson says, the whatever the way things go is that government grows and liberty yields. There's no question government is vastly bigger than it was in 1974, or even in 1944 in many ways, even though we were in war. And yet we are freer. We have more choices. We have more economic freedom than we had in 1974. We have more wealth. We have more stuff to buy. And that is a contradiction that I think libertarian thinking needs to kind of confront, which is that the size of government is problematic for sure, but government isn't the only source of suppression, repression, oppression, or of freedom, and things like that. So something is going on here. But to your basic point of why do people feel bad given that they are materially better off and they have more options, I think a big starting point of that is a lack of understanding of the past, including the recent past, but also the longer past.
Are you just calling the average person stupid?
Yeah, no, I don't think so. But I think, this is something you were talking about leadership. One of the things I would like to do, or I like to try and emphasize, is like, okay, are we going in the right direction? I think it was Russ Roberts, or I can't remember who talked about being a directional libertarian. I call myself sometimes that, or an adjectival libertarian, where I no longer think about it as a noun, but it's an adjective and it's a modifier. And the default setting is that, I think more people should have more freedom to make meaningful choices in their lives. And are we kind of going in in the direction or the movement towards more of that or less of that? And I think we want to go in the direction of more. And one of the ways that you get people to understand that and why it's good, and also how you get there, is by studying history, and comparing where you are to where your parents were and to where other people are and things like that.
One of the things in surveying that history, there's a couple
Yeah.
things that came to mind that I'm going to try to sort
Okay.
of. So one that really resonated with me, you said, you look in the 1950s and people were complaining about problems in a very similar way to today. And a very specific example of that is in Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning.
Yeah.
So my son read that book and in like 7th grade, because
Yeah.
he wasn't going to a traditional school that sucks. He was going to
Yeah.
a good school. And so he actually got to read important things.
Yeah.
And it made him into like a little stoic.
Yeah.
It was hugely powerful. And so last summer I read it, thinking I had read it, and realizing then when I read it, I hadn't read it before.
Right.
I only heard,
you had looked at the words or something.
right, or
Yeah.
I'd heard it summarized
Yeah.
and sort of, there's several concepts in it that you hear them and
Yeah.
you just have to hear even like them in a single sentence, and
Right.
they kind of unlock things for
Yeah.
you. So the first half of the book is about Viktor Frankl's experience in all of the worst concentration camps.
Mhm.
And then the back half is his essentially psychological framework for
Mhm.
understanding how to live a life that's mentally healthy and with meaning.
Right.
And that meaning, one of the
This
things,
is logotherapy.
logotherapy. And one of the things I think in some ways, it's the best book for our times,
Yep.
bar none. But one of the things that's so interesting is, so he's written this, at least the edition that I was reading, and he's talking about the young people of the 1950s, and that they are already experiencing a purpose void,
Mhm.
that their plenty has given rise to a sense of meaninglessness, that they're losing connection to family, community, faith, the institutions that bind and help you understand your place in the world. And it's 1950. So we're
Right.
thinking like,
No,
this is
that's Ozzie and Harriet and Leave It to Beaver, and when things were good, because we're roughly the same age, and like if you grew up in the 80s, you learned that the 50s was the last good decade in America.
And there
Right.
was a couple waves, and you've written about this in the past, about sort of both left and right
Yeah.
have a nostalgia for the 50s in different ways. The left thinks, it was strong unions and 90% tax rates. And,
yes, one man could support 3 wives and 4 families on an automaker, auto worker.
yeah, and we had manufacturing jobs and all this sort of stuff. So it cuts in all these interesting ways. But one way to look at that seemingly almost irrational or continued struggle in the face of material progress, and this has been, is that materialism isn't everything,
for sure,
and that there actually is a spiritual void that is real. We as a being, we only live so long. We all have the same 24 hours in a day. Arthur Brooks talks about the 4 quadrants of happiness being faith, family, community, and work. And that maybe it isn't just the past 20 years. Maybe it's the past 150.
Yeah.
But that there has been something that, like our material prosperity, our access to goods and services has skyrocketed, but we're still the same caveman. And we've allowed some of that to throw some of our babies out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
A couple of things. One, I want to point out, because I'm a big fan of Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, there are legitimate questions about the provenance of the memoir part of that book, that he may have used other people's stories and kind of mashed them together in pursuit of a higher truth, which is worth thinking about.
For the first half?
Yeah, given like what that book is about, and and it's about an individual, et cetera. So I find that's just as a kind of footnote. The other thing, I agree with you that is a great book to be reading. It is also in the work of Christopher Lasch, who's a writer who came to public acclaim in the late 70s with a book called The Culture of Narcissism, and in the early 80s, a book called The Minimal Self. He identified Frankl and a few other people, of not necessarily them, but people took in the post-war era, they began to kind of arbitrage Frankl and other Holocaust survivors' experiences for life in post-war America. And, Betty Friedan is a good example.
What does that mean exactly?
So what it means is that suddenly people are like, Betty Friedan in The Feminine Mystique talked about how being a suburban housewife was like being in a comfortable concentration camp. So it's
Everything's compared to Hitler.
Everything. Well, and everything is like, oh, my mild discomfort or whatever is akin to surviving the Holocaust. And that's such a category error, which persists to this day when people on the right and the left talk about persecution or, like the viability of life in late capitalism or something. And it's like, what are you freaking talking about? Right. So I think, and it's interesting to think about that because I agree. Everybody, I don't believe it assigned reading, I guess, but like everybody would benefit from reading Man's Search for Meaning. And because it gets at something that is important. And I also want to, before I go on to that a little bit, we haven't just had material progress, and this is really important. We have had moral progress because people are treated more equally now than they were in the 50s, certainly the 1850s. And that's not a small thing. That is huge. And the fact that, we can worship the way we want or not. That opens up choices. That is definite progress, but it also makes it harder for the individual to figure out what to do. And so I come back to, I had mentioned Camus and existentialism, and there's kind of a interesting way of thinking about Sisyphus and Prometheus, if we're using Greek myths. The myth of Sisyphus, as Camus is, the way that he figured it, and this became a major text for post-war America, particularly the counterculture. But it's like, you're thrown into a world where you have to create your own meaning on a daily basis, and you have to do it knowing every day the boulder is going to roll back down. And, Camus famously imagines Sisyphus smiling while he does this work. I want to add to that the idea of Prometheus, that we steal fire from the gods. And this is probably, I was influenced by people like Stuart Brand, who created the Whole Earth catalog, and other people who worked with him, and like Kevin Kelly, where, we have this terrible, terrible freedom, right? Where I don't have to worship the gods that my parents were told, to worship, and because their parents were told, and going back 1,000 years of peasants and serfs in Ireland and Italy. And that is great. I want to live in this world, but it also means I've got to do a lot of work to build new institutions, because you can't go back to 1950. You can't go back to 1970, or 1850 or anything like that. And one of the things where I think we've been deficient is building new institutions that respond to, where we are. So to your point about spiritualism or a spiritual dimension, we can mince words about, okay, is it spiritual? Is it this or is it that? It's like, how do you ground yourself in a world of meaning? And, it's community. It can be religious, or it could be something else. It could be work, intentional communities, are a thing. And this is where we're at. We've finally pushed clear of all of the jungle and the forest of human struggle to where we now have most of our time is spent doing symbolic processing and symbolic action. What are the institutions that will allow us to create meaning and sustain meaning and purpose in our lives? And that's, I think, a big part of what libertarianism, needs to be doing. And we're not going to get there by saying, okay, here's the one best way to live, and now let's kind of build everything so everybody lives this one way. The flight of, human history has been a flight of conformity, flight from conformity, and forced conformity. We are among the first generations to live in a world where anything is possible. And then it's like, okay, anything is possible, get to work.
We sit here, it is Friday, November 22nd. I'm not sure when we'll release this conversation, but today, a video will be going live on this channel in which I advocate for norms.
Yeah.
And a bell curve of culture. And so I want to throw this at you because I think this might be the area where maybe I'm just getting older. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I think that here's a mini version of the thesis, and we can put a link to the video on this because you're touching on this so strongly. So you go through human history, and you have, if you kind of graph it, with the vertical axis being social acceptability, the bottom of which being death. You know, oh, you're so unacceptable. We
Yeah,
stone you to death. We burn you to death. We put you in prison. We kill you. And across the horizontal axis is behaviors. Through most of human history, it looks like a tower. It's like you can either be in the tribe doing the tribe's stuff, or you're kicked out, you're exiled,
Right.
you're killed, you're burned. Some look a little more like a stair step, where it's like, well,
A ziggurat.
yeah, you're in a caste system,
Yeah, yeah.
you're in a feudal system, whatever. But you know, you've got these very sharp dividing lines where you're kicked to the next tier down, and there is no ability to climb up. And in response to that, and I know this is super abstract, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Emerges a philosophy, and I would actually put libertarian thought in this category to some extent with communism. A world in which the line is flat, that along which, you know, you do you, man.
Yeah,
Whatever floats your boat.
Yeah.
There should be no social cost for the range of behaviors. Now, none of them actually really believe that, because if you're in commie land, they want to throw you off the roof if you're not a communist.
Right.
And that's cancel culture and whatnot. And no libertarian thinks you should be able to kill people. The non-aggression principle says, no, you can do whatever you want so long as you leave me the hell alone. And then you're off the side. And I think this is part of me even just coming back to my Catholicism, which we've talked about offline a little bit, but I think these are ideal. That is like a ethos that's a kind of ideal form. And I think it turns out, because we are an animal and we live in a reality and we have a historically dependent path to how we have what we have, that it all looks a lot more like a curve.
Okay.
And what I mean, and I'll give you a couple of the most inflammatory examples. At the top of the curve, and this is a should, not is. There is an is, but there's a should.
Right.
At the top of the should is mom and dad get married and then have kids and stay together.
Right.
That's optimal.
Yeah.
It's just optimal. And we have seen, and you know, everything else off to the side, getting divorced, being gay, those things have moved from the fringes towards the middle. And I think it's better. We don't want to be throwing people off we don't want to be Iran.
Yeah.
But trying to say, no, it's all flat, it's all the same, that's not truth.
Who exactly is saying it's all the same? Because so like when you said, you know, I
Every
believe in
college sociologist.
Yeah,
all of
disagree.
the things we put our kids through.
I don't know, because like you know, first off, part of the reason why I recoil from the left as much as the right, and I've never seen myself as either being on the left or the right. I'm just like, I only know libertarian thinking, you know, as a kind of ideological category, is that the left doesn't prize diversity. They want to manage the way people are and the vast difference among people. They have, you know, it like when you hang out with leftists, you're not like loose and like, hey, anything goes. It's like everybody is like, oh, I better not say the wrong thing because I'll be cast out, because there's a very rigid and you know, clear, you know, what demarcation of what is acceptable and what isn't. You know, there's a lot of wrongthink that people are always worried about.
Right.
And I think that happens a different way on the right. For me, the question isn't, are norms good? Norms will always exist and they will crop up in any given situation. It's like, do you have the freedom to choose the norms or to create the norms that work for you? And to me, this is, you know, and the late David Bose and I talked about this a lot. You know, libertarian thinking and kind of individualist thinking, in many ways, ironically, given that many libertarians were, I think this is changing, were, you know, very vociferous atheists, but it really came out of the English civil wars of the 17th century, which were about the right of conscience. Like, do you have the right to worship God or not in the way that you want? Or does the state or some larger group, can they force you to do stuff? And out of that came kind of modern liberal philosophy, which is like, okay, you know what, there are places where you have to have an enforced consensus, but you should leave as much of that alone as possible. Like, norms take care of themselves. So the question isn't norms, yes or no. The question is, do you get to pick your norms? or not. And then you
I
need a
don't think that's
larger.
true. I don't think
Yeah,
that's
okay.
true.
I don't know
Really? You
what to
think
say because like I don't
you
know a
think
lot
norms
of
take care of themselves?
I don't know a lot of gay people who were like, I'm choosing this, and then, you know, that is like the beginning and end of the conversation. There's still norms about all of this stuff and what does it mean to be gay in a straight society, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, when you say norms don't take care of themselves, I don't understand what that means because like I live in a world with different people and things like that, and we have norms of behavior. If you go to like, let's take a kind of Aquarian version of this, like at Burning Man. Burning Man is completely an opt-in community. Nobody has to go there.
Mm-hmm.
But if you go there, you are choosing to abide by a whole set of rules that are very explicit and are very clear and that kind of provide the grammar or the logic of how
Okay.
that community works.
So when you say norms take care of themselves, can I say that you're making a certain kind of assumption in that we do organize into communities around a shared consensus about here's what this community is, sometimes
right.
explicitly, sometimes
Yeah,
implicitly.
and sometimes the community is just like a small part of our lives. Other times it might be much more.
There are when I say they don't, here's what I'm referring to. We have to contend with there are institutions, and I don't think government is the only force
Right.
to blame, but it's a big one.
Yeah.
Especially our educational institutions that have had an agenda that is antithetical to the norms I think are healthy for most people most of the time.
Yep.
And it has been actively like, no, not that. This is the rise, and it certainly is outsized, but it's the rise of the trans conversation in our society. It's the rise of the fact that in California, vastly more young people identify as gender nonconforming than Idaho. So that's an example of like other things happening that give rise to, I think, toxic norms. And I'm not saying I can personally do anything about that.
No, but I hear what you're saying. But this is where do you know the book Exit, Voice, and Loyalty?
Yeah, this is Hirschman, is it?
Yeah, Albert O. Hirschman. But
Voice in it,
and the idea there is, or to put it in a religious context, when the Catholic Church didn't want people to leave the Catholic Church, it wasn't like people were leaving the Catholic Church to just go screw around. Like they were leaving to organize their own religions. And, so like norms, when I say norms take care of themselves, people don't leave an orthodoxy in order to just like free ride. Generally speaking, they create their own. What you're talking about, and let's leave the trans issue aside for a second. Like, the way public schooling has, become a huge thing in America, where it's like, where there's a general consensus. If you go to education colleges or you go to teachers colleges, like you learn certain types of things, not just particular types of pedagogy, but also the content of things that then kind of oozes through the system. I wouldn't say it's a conspiracy, but there's a system of influence. No, where it's like certain things matter. It's not always planned. That's all I'm saying. It's just, it's
more like conspiracy than not, I would say.
But it's
there's actual people who have a thing that they're doing. They are
a conspiracy. No, but a conspiracy is like, okay, we're going to kill Lincoln or something like that. This is just how influence works, right? But we don't need to labor that point too much. And the problem with public schooling is that there was, for a long time until very recently, there was virtually no exit, and also there was no way to reform the system from within. So then you're screwed, like where you don't have any options, and that's bad. But I think, a better world is one of universal school choice. Why? Not because
for sure
schools aren't going to have norms. It's that parents and kids and teachers and, everybody can kind of find where they fit. Because I don't know, are you, I was raised Catholic. I have 5 of 7 Catholic sacraments. I'm like way up there on the tote board. And it's like, I don't want to be Catholic anymore. And my grandparents, who, were raised in Ireland and Italy, that was not an option to leave. They came to America and they practiced Catholicism to varying degrees, but like that's a better world where Catholicism exists and the ability to leave Catholicism and either start your own religion, join another religion, or not be religious at all and find meaning somewhere else. That's a great world. That's the world we're in, and that's the world we should be celebrating. So and I'm just saying, like, this idea that we now live in a world where norms don't exist, I think is a misdiagnosis of what's going on. The problem is almost
I'm not
always
saying that they don't exist. What I'm arguing is that the battlefront is in part, there's multiple battles of ideas going on in our society, right? And I think one of them, and I think even to some extent, I think this election has played a role culturally in shining a light on this, with some stuff like the trans issue in particular, is a philosophy that is blank slate, like equity, inclusion, flat line,
right.
You do you. And I'm not anti you do you. I am a classical liberal, but you shouldn't even feel any cost. There should be no such thing as shame. You can be healthy at any size. Like statements that just shade into, well, now you're just a liar. You can't be healthy at any size. That's a lie, and it's actually a deeply damaging lie for people.
Yeah, I think I don't disagree with you, in the abstract, but it's like I don't know any fat people who are like, you know what, like I feel good. I live in a world post fat shaming. It's like, and you have official avenues maybe of people saying like, don't fat shame, but like the world is not kind to fat people. Fat people are not kind to fat people. So I think a lot of this is overdrawn. And the trans issue, I want to, in thinking about our conversation and other things, first off, like adults, right? Maybe that's 18, maybe it's 21, maybe it's 16. I don't know, but like adults have a right to
100%.
transform their bodies.
We both
right?
know Deirdre McCloskey and
well, and I know
others,
other,
and other people.
And then there are also cases of children, of minors who have psychological problems that are related to how they feel about their body and things like that. And I'm not saying, I don't think anything should be mandated, but I am very slow to say certain things should be prohibited. The problem isn't trans ideology. The fact is that there is a vast archipelago of low security, minimum security prisons we call schools that then things get forced through, and the answer to that is to get rid of the prison system, not to get rid of what individual people might believe or not, or what parents might agree. Because in a way, if you abstract out the content and you say, okay, well, parents shouldn't be allowed to teach their kids a particular way of being, like then you're back to a place where homeschooling was not legal in America until the 70s,
right?
And it's still not legal in many countries,
including Germany.
Which is like, and you understand why Germans are like, we don't want people to be getting together in small groups without state supervision, because the last time we allowed that, Nazism arose. I mean, that's the kind of mentality there.
The self-contradiction of that.
But it's so what I'm saying is like the larger frame of things is a liberal order. I once, years ago, you mentioned Charles Murray. This was in a review of Bose's Libertarianism, a primer, and Murray's What It Means to Be a Libertarian, which he thankfully published right after the bell curve. So it's like, okay, there's a good pairing, right? But I talked about libertarianism and liberalism as an operating system where there are places, I'm not an anarchist. I think, there are places where there is a need for enforced consensus, in things like property rights or whatever, where there are consequences. But the idea is to create an operating system where as many programs can run on that system without crashing it as possible. And so you want the operating system to be as lean and as basic as possible. And that is kind of like, respect for property rights. It might be, don't hurt people and take their stuff, whatever. But then after that, you have to pull back and let people find their meaning where they do. And in the current moment, that means dismantling a
Yes.
huge amount of stuff.
100%.
So I'm not saying like we accept the world as it is and then just kind of live within it. No, like we scrape the barnacles off the hull of, of a kind of libertarian or a liberal operating system. I think we're doing that in school choice, and it's because of COVID as much as anything. I mean, people have been toiling in the fields for decades for school choice. I myself went to Catholic school. I didn't realize that I had an alternative education
Yeah.
until I got to college.
Me
And I was
too.
like, oh, that's really weird. Like what Catholics focused on compared to people I knew who went to much better public high schools anyway. But we want more alternatives. That's all I want, is like everybody to be able to create their own alternative or join with other people and things like that. So I think that is very important, but that is different than saying what we have, like we know the best way to do anything, and hence we should enforce that.
Well, I think that at one level, so this past year, starting like a year ago, I took my son to RCIA, the adult rite, which is
Right.
because he hadn't gone to Catholic school.
Yeah.
He was baptized but didn't get the other sacraments.
Right.
And he was actually going, because we're weird and because we've ripped him through all these different schools. He changed schools his senior year for a bunch of reasons that I won't bore everyone with. And so he actually entered a different school senior year of high school.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this Catholic school, actually like over almost 90% Mexican American, many first generation. Had a great time. But I said, look, I made a promise that I would raise you Catholic. You will ultimately have to decide what your relationship is to that. But we're doing this. You can, if you want to object strongly, fine. But if you don't, we're going to do this together. And every Sunday we went to this essentially theology class. So I only went back to I felt like I was back in high school.
Yeah.
And the two of us were we quickly became known as like the philosophical, like, wait, what do you mean by freedom?
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like freedom.
Right.
And one of the things that I was struck by, aside from just how wonderful it was to spend that time together with my son. Because it would be like all Sunday, there'd be philosophical, moral conversations that would stem from this, was that at least in the Catholic tradition, for all of its reputation of being rigid and being this giant power structure, the fundamental moral lesson is that free will is at the beating heart of the moral journey of a Catholic, and that you can't be a moral actor unless you are free, unless you choose the good. And the Catholic definition of freedom, one that I think John Paul II articulates, is something to the effect of, we have freedom so that we can choose the good, which doesn't really sound like freedom.
Right.
It sounds like you have freedom to go along these tram lines.
Right.
And you can choose to go off the tram lines and crash, but so I think that there is a I agree with that. I don't think you can have a good society, a sustainable, free or happy or moral society in which you just tell everyone, here's the right way to live, and if you don't, we're throwing you off a roof. I don't
Which fairly defines Catholicism up to a certain point in its evolution or history. I mean, let's be clear, in Europe, in medieval Europe, and even in early modern Europe, depending on where you were. And then sometimes, the first thing that Luther did after breaking away was starting engaging in religious wars with other Protestants, right, as well as Catholics. So I'm not diminishing anything that you're saying. I think it sounds great. I mean, my heart was leaping when you were saying, like, my son and I did this together. That's phenomenal. But recognize also that, when you say we're free so we can choose the good, like in a Catholic context, there's a set of Catholic teachings, but it's also God is going to know even more than the Pope, right? So like, it's always going to be a struggle. And, Catholicism is doing really well. It's the single largest religion on the planet. When you break everything down into constituent parts.
If you split Islam into Shiites and Sunnis.
And all the Protestants and Hindus and whatnot. And it's like, it's doing well because it works for people. It's also radically changed. I know one of the things that was fascinating is, to listen to my parents talk about what it meant to be Catholic as the children of immigrants. My mother didn't speak English until she went to school. What it meant to be Catholic in America in the 1930s in, ethnic ghettos. Is very different than by the time when I was going to Catholic school in the 70s compared to what it is now, where Catholics are the single largest religious group in America. And there is no social opprobrium against being Catholic in a way that there was, in the 40s or 50s. I mean,
Yeah,
people might
not
be
as
like,
much.
I
I
think
mean,
you're
look, we've got a
weird.
Catholic. We just had a second Catholic president in Joe
Without,
Biden, and
yeah,
nobody made a.
nobody
I mean,
cared. Yeah, nobody cared
technically
about
nominally Catholic,
yeah,
but yeah.
nobody cared about the Catholic nature of it, So all I'm getting at is that it's great that you can find that and choose that, and then also recognize that what it means to be Catholic changes over time because we're constantly adapting and struggling to find meaning. What I think, and this is, I think, where we have a significant amount of agreement is, what we need to be doing. And I think this is particularly true for libertarians who oftentimes talk about being individuals, although less and less in a lot of ways. But we need to be building the institutions that help us figure out these questions of like, okay, how do you have a meaningful life? How do you get up and work towards a goal? How do you find people that are doing that? And like, this is what worked in the Middle Ages, what worked in the 1920s is not going to work now. And we have to figure out how we adapt our existing institutions or how we leave them behind and create something anew.
There's a couple threads here that I want to explore with
Yeah.
you. So one is, and I think there's other folks sort of in our friend group like Michael Shermer who are part of this actively. There is a relationship between the sort of burn it down new atheists and a certain kind of libertarian ethos, partly because of literal overlap of, in some cases, the same people being in both camps. I think that right now, as we sit here, there's been there's a lot less enthusiasm for that new atheist project.
Yeah, I agree. It won.
It was like, well, we didn't really build anything to replace what we wanted to tear down. People derive a lot of meaning in things from this stuff that we said is all a bunch of silly spaghetti monster in the sky nonsense. And we offered them cold and not even realistic objective scientism in response, which is weird because humans aren't particularly rational. I think the objectivist hope for people to just be perfect rational actors is similarly utopian in its nature. How do you grapple with that energy and where do you kind of think it is? Because I think it does feel like it's kind of rightfully driven itself into a ditch, and I'm kind of happy for that.
I mean, I think it kind of did its job. Think about it in terms of like, this may not make any sense. I'm not even sure it makes sense to me, but like in the American Revolution, there's Sam Adams and John Adams. And like you need Sam Adams in the revolution, but then afterwards he's a little bit nuts. He was great at pulling something down, but not so great at building something. So then you need John Adams more. And I think maybe the new atheism, which I was never a part of, I call myself an apatheist. Like I just don't care that much about religion. I was raised very Catholic. And it, through my high school graduation, my life in many ways, and I look back on this, more with understanding it better, my life kind of revolved around the Catholic Church because I went to Catholic school and, everybody I knew and hung out with, we were all in that system of meaning. And it meant a lot to my parents, partly because of the circumstances under which they grew up. But to have like, the Catholic Church was, a haven in a strange land where, it wasn't good being Catholic. It meant being poor. And you found out like everybody that I grew up with had at least one parent or grandparent who didn't speak English, and they were all Catholic. And like my parents, when they got together and they got married in 1950, but like the Irish and the Italians didn't get along, and like it,
I hate you. Let's get married.
Yeah, the only way that they could possibly get married was that they were both Catholic, because they were a little bit conformist in a way. But all I'm getting at,
being apathetic is I would consider median Catholic adult.
Yeah, what I'm getting at with atheism, like I understood why the atheists were the way they were, and I was friendly with Christopher Hitchens, who was great to talk to, but even towards the end of his life, he was starting to embrace a Jewish, I wouldn't say a Jewish identity, certainly not a religion, but like he had these, traditions and communities and intellectual groups that he was part of that did the function of religion for other people. So he didn't need religion. I kind of feel that way, like I'm enmeshed in, an ideological movement, as well as kind of, an understanding of certain types of literary and cultural movements that I don't, I chose that over Catholicism. I may go back to it. I kind of doubt it, but it's just so
you've given me a minor project.
Yeah, I am.
I can be the Arthur Brooks to you as he was to me.
Yeah, well, this is what I'm getting at is that like I'm neither like super for religion, and I don't think it's the salvation of humanity, literally or figuratively, but I also don't think atheism is, and I would rather hang out most of the time with religionists rather than atheists because they're more interested. Like there's a rich history of intellectual ferment within Catholicism, within Judaism, within various strands of Protestantism. I had a lot of friends in college who were evangelical, and I was like given to reading things really closely. And it's like the difference between getting a PhD in literature and being an evangelical preacher is minimal, because it's like it's a intense focus on the text and what went into the text and what does the text mean and how does the context change things, etc. So all I'm saying is I think it's great that you are able in 21st century America to go to a version of Catholicism and share it with your son who may or may not stick with it, and that you are free to choose that, as well as it was able to develop because of various historical contingencies, but mostly a broadening of human freedom, where people can pursue all sorts of communities of meaning in their lives. And we use these things, for a certain amount of time, and then we lose interest in it. My parents, who were very Catholic, at a certain point, they were like, the Catholic community did not work for them, and they just it kind of fell away. So.
This is there's a challenge that stems out of this that is part of where I find myself struggling with these, and it's sort of it's taking my we talked about, like, you come into this world of ideas, Ron Paul, Murray Rothbard, anarcho-capitalism.
By the way, Ron Paul, I have not seen people really talk about this. He is a hardcore evangelical Baptist.
He's very religious.
But it's
he doesn't really talk about it very
fascinating. He
much.
doesn't talk about it very much, other than kind of abortion. And even that, he's, every year, I think he was in Congress, he introduced legislation to ban abortion at the federal level. But he doesn't really talk about it. And it's kind of fascinating, particularly because a lot of his followers are very traditionalist Catholics. And like when you look at the history.
Is that really?
Yeah, when you
I guess I'm in that category.
Yeah, when you look at the history of like what evangelical Baptists and Catholics, like they don't get along. There's like doctrinal differences that have real ramifications. But he, in a way, is a model of like whatever else libertarianism gives him, he has this whole other world that gives him value and centers him, that is distinct from that kind of political operating system.
The one of the things, I had this conversation with Peter Boghossian, and we got into this, and he's a more strident atheist, although he even doesn't particularly like getting on the kind of rhetorical barbs of the new atheist. Like nobody, does anybody even want to fight that fight anymore? It seems like the answer to that's no.
Yeah, and if I may, just it's I interviewed Richard Dawkins a couple months ago. He's doing like a Last American tour, and he's one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse of new atheism and everything. And like I said to him, like, what's it like to win? Not that everybody is an atheist, because in the end, I don't think that was the goal, but like we live in a fully secular world, at least in the West. And, when you look at a place like Iran, the biggest problem there, it's not economic policy, it's that it's a theocracy. But we live in a secular world, and it doesn't mean that religion has vanished. It just means that its role is different, and it becomes, I think, more meaningful. It's more meaningful to choose to be a Catholic in contemporary America than it was to be a Catholic in medieval France or Italy.
I think that's absolutely true. When I was making The Pursuit with Arthur Brooks, we went to Denmark, and there's a scene in the film where we're in a public library, and people have come together to sing Christian hymns. None of them believe in any of it. And we asked the guy who's the organizer of this morning ritual, and he's like, "Yes, we like to come and sing. It makes us feel good." And it's like, "Well, does anybody believe in the words they're actually singing?" "Well, no, not really."
Yeah.
And we come outside, and Arthur's like, "Yeah, this is what happens when you have state-run religion instead of a competitive marketplace in religion. Is everyone rejects it because it's forced on them, and then no one believes anything."
Yeah, this is why. Well, I don't know about that second part, but definitely, and Roger Williams, the founder of Providence, Rhode Island, who got the charter, he was co-founded the first Baptist congregation in America, and he escaped from Massachusetts Bay Colony and the theocracy there. He actually accused them of teaching a Catholic covenant of works, not grace. So they were like, "Okay, we're going to send you back to England where you'll be hanged." And he famously escaped into the New England winter and ended up buying property from the Indians there, et cetera. Roger Williams is one of the great libertarian heroes of history, but also he is one of the archetypal Americans. And his basic belief, he wrote the first extended argument in favor of fully secular government because he thought if religion and politics are mixed, it pollutes religion. And I think he got that right in the 17th century.
Well, I think even as we sit here, for all of the decline in participation in religion and belief in God in America, America might even be more religious than Iran as a population. I think we might be
that's interesting.
We might be the most religious country as a matter of population participation of anywhere in the rich world.
Yeah.
So here's my question / challenge, and I don't have an answer to this.
Yeah.
One could make the argument. So I think what you've put forward is a vision of social evolution, going through phases, making use of the things at the time that work that keep us moving forward, whatever forward means, and making progress. I'm putting those in scare quotes for a reason. Is that fair?
Yeah, I'd say so. And let me, if I can underscore, and this is on my mind because of talking to Dawkins, but one of the things that he did, not in his atheism work, but in his biology or evolutionary discussion, is that evolution is not, it's an ongoing process. It doesn't build towards progress. And, in the 19th century and early 20th century, people thought of evolution as leading to more and more complex organisms with man at the pinnacle of evolutionary processes. And it isn't that at all. What it just creates more stuff and more species and more attempts to survive in a planet that is not particularly conducive to life.
Fitness.
So I don't believe, in a way, my litmus test for progress, moral progress, is, are people allowed to make more important choices in areas of their life that matter to them? And so I don't have a particular endpoint, and that means they will believe this, or it's not progress. It's just kind of like, do we have more choices? That's progress for me.
So the reason why I brought Peter up, and I'll try to weave these together as best I can, is we got into this back and forth about the woke ideology, the identitarian tribal thing. And people who've more scholarly and smarter than me have probably delved into this with a lot of depth. But there was a light switch that went off for me in talking to him, because I think I clicked into something about, wait a second, if I were an alien and I came to this planet and just observed the human animal and its behavior, what would I observe over the stretch of human existence? I think some of the things I would observe is these are incredibly groupish creatures who are very tied to their identity as a sense of purpose, who fight with each other largely on that basis, and are in a kind of constant battle over their identity and dominance over each other in pursuit of their own ends. And there's a certain amount of might makes right that comes along with that. And that's what the human is.
Right.
Not what it should be.
Right.
It's just what it is. So if I'm a rationalist looking at the human animal, that's what we are. And so I think that the argument I'd like to lay out to get your reaction to is this. Classical liberalism and libertarian thought may be best understood as existing inside of a fundamentally radically Christian path or context, because the notion that we all have equal human dignity is not a material notion.
Right.
It's not true. It's actually false. It's an assertion of untruth in the world.
Right.
It's metaphysical.
Yeah.
And so Christ, I'm going to just stick to Christian.
Yeah,
I know there's other
yeah.
thinkers who've done this too, but Christ comes along and says, no, what are you? You're like a prostitute? You're like a tax collector? I love all of you equally because you all are God's children.
Why did he have to include the tax collectors? That's our predicament to this day.
So you have this revolution. Class doesn't matter, race, none of it matters. Catholic means universal. And so you have this, even the Catholic Church in its strictures is the soil out of which a plant of liberalism can grow on an assertion that is not science, it is not fact, it is not observable, it's false. And now we have these plants, these flowers of liberty, and along comes our generation and says we can cut those flowers and put them in a vase and they're going to do just fine into the future.
Right.
And maybe they can't. Maybe that's a cut flower and cut flowers eventually die.
Right.
Because it's the roots, which are not reality. They're something else. They're a metaphysics. They're the universal truth, if you believe it or not. But they're not reality. They're not what the alien observer the silicon life form would observe. I am more inclined than I used to be to say, I think that story might be right. And I think we have to grapple with that.
Well, and the one thing I would take exception to is when you say this is false. It's not that it's false. It's just, the idea that we all have equal standing, which I think liberalism as a political philosophy, which has transformed the world, is a secularized version of Christian kind of autonomy of souls or equality of souls. That, if it's true that we all have souls and we're all equal, and, this is the Catholic part especially, that we're all equally sinful in the eyes of God, that flattens us in a way, and then that creates certain implications for social structures or political structures.
Right. Equal rule of law, all of it.
This, again, if you look at the 17th century, my ex-wife is a scholar of 17th century British and colonial American literature. And, in many ways, that fight over the right of conscience to worship God as you see fit or not, that by the end of the 17th century, beginning of the 18th century, becomes secularized in what we call liberal philosophy, which is that we are all equal before the law. And, certain people might have more money or more status or whatever, but that there's a limit to that as an operating system of how a society works. I tend to believe that. And it may be, it is a story, and it is not necessarily one that is rooted in, biological reality or any kind of empirical reality. And you need to keep rehearsing it and changing it in the same way that when it was merely a religious story, it didn't lead to peace. It didn't lead to commerce. It did, as much as it did once it was secularized. So I don't know if that gets to anything that you were talking about, but
well, I guess the question is, and I'll add one little piece to the puzzle. What is often sort of brought to the table as the alternative is something like utilitarianism. Like, okay, Well, it just kind of works that if we act
Yeah, yeah,
as
yeah.
if the greatest good for the greatest many,
Right.
it
Yeah.
points us in a pretty good direction. But it is, I find it to be kind of philosophically like flimsy, because it's like, okay, we can't measure utility.
Right.
So you're asserting a kind of philosophical math that is trying to be kind of materialist,
Yeah.
and you have no yardstick that works. Like
I'm sympathetic to what you're saying, and I also recognize that certain people will say, well, liberal political philosophy is just masking a massive will to power, and so that it, and these are critics mostly on the left, although you'll also see some people on a kind of hyper traditionalist right or a dark Enlightenment right will say, it's not a coincidence that as liberal political philosophy spread throughout Europe, they started becoming, imperial and taking over parts of the, all over the world and trying to dictate everything. And they were using this liberal talk of, rule of law and individualism as a cover for a massive will to power. I don't find that critique particularly compelling in the long run. And I also resist utilitarianism because it is that question of like, well, what if I just like doing this? Like, I don't have to explain myself to you. I might have to explain myself to God or whatever exists afterwards. But as long as I am not, openly harming you, we've come to an arrangement where it's like, other than certain small as possible areas where we need to have coercion and forced agreement, I can do whatever I want. So, like, don't come here and tell me that I need to be doing this so more people are happy.
do you have any worry that this cut flower story has some truth to it, and that what that truth would mean is that we could be operating on a kind of borrowed time
Mhm.
until an actual spiritual thing reemerges? Like the trend
Yeah.
towards less religion could be a doomsday clock. That would be the implication of
Yeah,
that.
I don't. I mean, I don't have that concern because I think that, it is a story and it takes different forms. But what is most important is that we are not teaching the value of a liberal society and of, and understanding again that this is an operating system that allows a lot of other things to happen. And I do think like if you don't tend to the operating system, you end
It
up
gets
with
buggy.
yeah, you end up with like Windows 2000, right? Or something, and it's just like, okay, this was a mistake. Let's go back and forward at the same time. And I do think this, again, is something that libertarian thinking helps keep alive, and it keeps showing why it still matters and why it's relevant and why giving people more autonomy in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, in the cultural sphere, in their personal lives ultimately yields a better world and a more sustainable world, in literally and figuratively.
My second to last question. What do you see as the most important project for, like, philosophical
Yeah,
project for the movement that I think that you and I are both a part
yeah,
of?
yeah, yeah.
Where does the work need to be done that is new for this time?
So I think it's a mix of two things, and they're tightly related. And I will also throw in a great Christian novel as a cherry on top because it seems appropriate. Um, I think one is keeping the history of human progress, of moral and material progress, in full view of people, and also interrogating and learn. History isn't something that's discovered, like you're walking and you see the Grand Canyon. It's constantly being recreated and from the current moment. And you want to avoid Whig history, where like everything in the past happened exactly the way it did. So to bring me to this point where everything is perfect or I'm the smartest person in the world, like you don't want that, but you need to keep alive what were the battles of the past that were won and lost, and how did they affect where we are now? Because there's still a ton of old stuff that needs to be wiped out. I mean, it's we were talking about like the public school system, like
Yes,
that it would
kill it.
be a better world if there were more opt-outs, et cetera. And the way you argue that is by talking about the past as well as what are the alternatives. And this is the other thing is like I was saying before, we've cleared this space where we've reached the end of the jungle, or the forest. And I realize now I don't even like those metaphors because a lot of cool stuff it happens in the jungle, and it's its own
Yeah.
ecosystem and everything. But like we're I mean, we're sitting here. We're in NoHo on Bleecker Street near Bowery, half a block from CBGB's. Where punk music was, kind of crystallized. But my father was born in Hell's Kitchen, a couple miles from here, where I happen to live in the 1920s, and it's like we live in such a better world than the world that he grew up in. Which was nasty, brutish, mean, not necessarily short, but it was bad. Like we're in a better world. What are the systems and laws and institutions and mindsets that have allowed for so much material and moral progress? That's a huge part of it, okay, for me, what libertarians need to constantly be doing. And then we also need to be showcasing all of the alternatives. Like what do people do with their freedom that is interesting? Not to say everybody should do that, but it's like, look at that. That's interesting and it's inspiring. And I'm going to look at, something like, say, like Burning Man as a community. I'm going to look at that and see how it's working and maybe take some of it and adapt it into my life and the things that I'm doing. How do entrepreneurs innovate? How do you come up with Uber? Where does that come from? And like, look at how all of these different options, how people who live differently, who have a different sexuality, who have a different aesthetics that they live by. Like, we need to be looking at those things and kind of breaking them down and showcasing the ones that we think are positive and talking about why they're positive and how you might adapt that into your own life, as well as looking at ones that are negative, that end in a dead end, and explaining why.
One thing that makes me think about as somebody who, as a kid, wanted to be a Disney animator, and I was drawing from an early age. And one of the things that I just remember at the very earliest stages of drawing is first you traced, and then you copied, and then you started to create your own stuff. Now, obviously, you created your own stuff all along the way, but actually the building up of the muscles to trace and then to copy and then to emulate were the necessary preconditions to be able to then hybrid and combine and create something new. And I feel like that's maybe the biggest weakness of the modern mind, is to say, ex nihilo, I'm here.
Yeah.
It's year zero. I can do whatever I want.
No, I completely agree. And it's not coincidental, but it's shocking to me that, I think about this in terms of rock music. I was always interested in rock music. And when I was growing up, again, this is the 70s and 80s, like I would come across bands and I'd be like, oh, I like that. And most of the time the record albums didn't even have like the full names of the band on it or anything. And like, where did you go? Like, you can't go to your hometown library and they're going to have a reference book on, rock bands or something. Like maybe they had the Rolling Stone record guide, but like, I was so starved for information about the things I liked and the genealogy of them. Like, who were these people and where did they come from and all of that. And now we live in a world where all of the music of the past is available, at a couple of clicks of a button. All of the information, Wikipedia is one of the great modern marvels of the modern world. And we should talk about it. And why does it work? Where is it getting a little bit, why is it good, et cetera? But like you have all of this information of the past, so you can create your genealogy. So you know who you are, where you are, how you are situated in the world, and where you want to go next. And people are more presentist than ever, where it's like, I don't know, the past doesn't matter.
That's the irony.
Yeah.
It's all there for us, and yet we're too busy with what's the next thing on the feed, and let me
or whatever
refresh the feed for the next thing.
So this is, and I had mentioned, I'm going to throw this in because I'm an evangelist for this novel, and I'm not sure why. I know I read it first in a high school reading group that was after school that this wonderful teacher put together, but it's a novel from 1951 or 52 or something called Barabbas by Per Lagerkvist, who was a Swedish writer who won a Nobel Prize for literature for this book. And you'll know the story of Barabbas. A lot of people don't, but Barabbas is the thief and the killer and the murderer who is ransomed instead of Jesus when brought before Pontius Pilate, and it's like, I can let Jesus free or Barabbas free. And what this novel does, I choke up even thinking about it. It's, so Barabbas is freed, and it's like he should have been put to death, and suddenly he is given freedom, like his life is back, and it's like, I could just get out of here. And it's a short novel, but it follows like, how does he make sense of this incredible gift of life that he doesn't deserve? It's unearned, but
Yeah.
suddenly he is free to live his life again. And like, what does he do with that? And to me, that is where we are at. Whether you think of it in secular terms or in religious terms, we are at a point where we are more free than ever. It's kind of unearned because the people in the past are the ones who sacrificed for us, right? They're the ones who,
Yeah.
put their lives on the lines or came up with interesting that allows us to do whatever we want. And our responsibility is to figure out, what do we do with this gift? How do we extend it? How do we share it with more people? And ultimately, how do we build meaning in a world of virtually limitless options and not turn back on ourselves and shut the door and say like, okay, it's too much. I'm just going to retreat into some kind of neurotic, inward folding structure that is just terrible.
I ask this question of every guest. We call the show Dad Saves America.
Mm-hmm.
You and I are both dads.
Yeah.
And I think as a man, it is a role that is heroic and essential and needs to be revitalized in a country where a quarter of our kids are being raised without one.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think about your role in all you do in the American story?
Wow. That's I think about it mostly in very stark personal terms, because my father was abandoned, his family was abandoned by his father, who was an immigrant from Ireland, and came to the New World to make a new life for himself, and he did, and then he split. And my father put in the time as a parent, but he was also stultified by his experiences, because he did not grow up in a world of love and things like that. And so when I think about being a father, and this is part of being a parent, because mothers and fathers, or two parents, whatever, like they take on different roles depending on the marriage, depending on the kids, all of this kind of stuff. But like, what I wanted to do was to provide the support that my father gave, but also be there emotionally for my kids, but also to show them a kind of unconditional love that they are not going to get elsewhere in the world.
And what about in the broader life of your work
Yeah.
and your role beyond just your family?
I mean, in this, I see myself mostly as a failure as a parent, as well as, kind of an individual. And this is probably the Catholicism kind of bleeding into everything. But, it's trying to be intentional, trying to be there. I mean, weirdly, a lot of parenting, I think, is being there. Like, and it doesn't mean you're licensed to be terrible or vacant, but, it's being there. And I think one of the things that has happened in American parenting life, and I think this reflects larger kind of crises of authority. And I know you've had Camilo Ortiz on and whatnot, who I'm very fond of both as a person and as a thinker.
Yeah, likewise.
But that, the people who are in charge have abdicated a lot of their responsibility, and and in the worst ways possible, where they're not stepping down and saying, okay, you take over. They're staying in power, but they're saying, we're not responsible, and maybe we can help you or not, or we're not going to give you any direction. We're not going to give you any firm lines from which you can start to depart or follow or whatever. And that is, that happens in parenting, and it happens in society. And I wish that we would kind of address that more fully and just say like, okay, this, and we only have imperfect knowledge, whether we're parents or whether we're governments or corporations or individuals, but say, based on where I am now and who I am now, this is what I believe to be true. And let's run with this. And then, we'll revise it as we need to. But the vacancy, I mean, we very briefly talked about COVID, but like, the biggest failure there was that the people who were in charge could not admit their their fallibility and then their liability
to this day.
Yeah. And, It's just be like, I don't know for sure, but this is where I'm at, and this is how I think we should proceed.
Nick Gillespie, thanks for being on Dad Saves America. This has been great.
My pleasure, John. Thank you so much.